I'm thrilled to welcome Spencer J. Case and Matthew Davis to this discussion. Spencer, you're a philosopher at the University of Colorado, and you obtained your PhD last year, that would be 2018, and the title of your dissertation was From Epistemic to Moral Realism, a Defense of Ethical Truth. And you're also a contributor for Quillette, Arc Digital, National Review, and other magazines. And Matthew, so I don't need to introduce you so much, so you are now a regular contributor to the podcast. And together we run the English language section of the bibliography format. So I offered you both to come discuss for this podcast the experiences of leaving one's religion after being raised in it as a child. And so you both were raised in different faiths as children, and we will discuss that in more detail. And so maybe, Spencer, you can open by explaining, what was your parents' faith? How was your childhood experience with religion? Maybe where you were living, if you had... I mean, you don't need to tell me whatever you feel comfortable sharing, but about your family and its relationship with religion when you were a child.
Yeah, okay. So my parents were and still are with my siblings the devout members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as the Mormon Church. Although recently I guess there have been some attempts to shed that kind of informal label. Let's see. I'm not really sure exactly what specifics to say here, except that the Mormon Church is very, I guess it would be called a high intensity religion. Like it's really quite involved. It's not like with some Catholics, it's common to go to Easter Mass or just show up on Christmas. But the Mormons, they really have you do a lot of different things. So you've got church on Sunday and then family home evening on Monday night, and then when you're youth, you've got, when you're young, you've got various youth group activities, maybe on Tuesday or Wednesday, and you've got seminary, in high school. And there's even this a Sunday school song that we sing about Saturday is the day we get ready for Sunday. So basically, they got you doing stuff related to the church every day of the week, and you're supposed to keep up with scripture study. That includes like the Bible and also the Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants. Other books that Mormons consider scripture. So it's really quite involved, and it's very communal in ways that I think are both positive and negative. Right, the Mormon Church really looks out for their own. They have a very significant welfare sort of system going. Really quite extraordinary. And they send people to look out for their members, and even the kids are sort of involved in this. Doing home teaching or visiting teaching, where you go and check up on people and give them a little spiritual lesson, see how they're doing. So I was involved with doing that. I was involved with when I was 12 with doing baptisms for the dead at the temple. It's a controversial practice that the church does, but I honestly don't see why it's a big deal or why Christians should be uncomfortable with the idea of vicarious rituals. So it was quite a good childhood and quite a positive experience. I don't regret being raised that way, although the doubts that I had increasingly that eventually caused me to leave were a considerable source of distress as I grew older.
Mm-hmm. And just a quick question to follow up on this. From which age onwards were you expected to take such an active role in religious life? I mean, specifically having these events every single day of the week.
Let's see. So you're baptized in the Mormon Church at age 8. It's considered to be the age of accountability. The Mormon Church reasons that there's no point in baptizing someone who's too young to like have a moral business, and they think that happens about around 8. Seems like a reasonable estimate.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one step. And then at age 12, for boys, that's when you get the Aaronic priesthood. There are like 2 steps of priesthood that that you're sort of inducted into. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but that they have blessing. And with that, this is for the male members only. And with that comes increased responsibility. So I'd say at about age 12, that's at the point when you're able to do baptisms for the dead, and you're sort of expected to take a more active role in things. But even if you're younger than that, if you're in a devout family, you're going to be doing things with the church pretty frequently.
Okay. So, yeah, Matthew, maybe you can answer broadly the same question about, the childhood years.
Sure. As long as I can remember, I was receiving instruction and stories from the entire maternal side of my family about Jehovah and doctrines of the Jehovah's Witnesses, and my story is a little bit lighter, I guess. My father was not a Jehovah's Witness,
mm-hmm.
and was opposed to my mother indoctrinating us in the religion. But he was a truck driver who made long trips in the truck, and she sort of smuggled us into the 3 meetings a week, and sometimes the field service, which is the phrase they use for the door-to-door proselytizing they do. And
right.
So I had I wasn't as immersed as it sounds like Spencer was, having his entire nuclear family as believers, but I spent most of my time with the maternal side of my family, so it was pretty close. But yeah, I would say, you see, my mother had her break from the religion when she was in her rambunctious years,
mm-hmm.
and then after having children, she rediscovered her her existential dread.
Okay.
And it was revitalized in her. So I remember there was kind of this this period from when my first memories started till about kindergarten, where I don't
mm-hmm.
recall ever hearing anything about it. But as soon as she thought I could understand, I started hearing about it, and that lasted. Well, it never really quite ended. We can get into this. I'm sure you want to put this off, but it would have lasted forever. But until I decided to part ways with it. And now my mother is actually a lapsed witness. She's not she didn't have an intellectual breakthrough
mm-hmm.
or like a change of conscience. It's just and it's actually, that's a source of stress for her, because I think she still struggles with the life's big question. So, but she doesn't go to meetings anymore. So it's kind of inside our house. It's very much non-existent.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But I would say until I was about 16 years old, I was going to meetings and going out door to door.
Okay. And so, did you go to religious schools? I mean, maybe Spencer, you can comment.
I did not go to a religious school. I mean, I went to a public high school, Pocatello High School, and I went to seminary, however, which is a sort of elective high school class that all Mormons are sort of expected to take, where you get an hour of release time in which you're not officially enrolled at the school, and then you would cross the street to a church-owned building, and you would have your hour of instruction there. And that's around the separation of church and state sort of issues.
Yeah.
So I had that, and then I even took, I think for a year, I took it at the college level too, but didn't continue with it, right? Because that was at the tail end of my feeling like I was a member of the LDS Church.
Okay. And you, Matthew?
No, we didn't have schools per se, but we had sort of these tracks that young people could go get on, and with the end game being a position at the headquarters in New York, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, which they call Bethel. You could, that starts with going door to door as a kid, and then you get promoted. It's sort of like there's ranks within the organization, and they have their names for those ranks. And that was the only type of, but no, besides that, as far as school goes, no, we all sort of did the same things. We had 2 meetings at the Kingdom Hall during the week, and then one less formal meeting at some members' we called that Bible study. But there was no like youth programs or schools like that, and they, that's typical of the Jehovah's Witnesses. They're sort of whatever anyone else is doing, they don't want any part of. So if it resembles any other religion, they're probably not doing it.
Okay. And so I should ask both of you, what were you supposed to believe as a child, and to what extent did you believe it? I mean, I'm sure it varied through time, but say as a pretty young child, not in your teenage years, but before that, did you have any doubts about it? So yeah, maybe Spencer, you can answer first.
Yeah, so the Mormons, although a lot of people don't consider them Christians because they reject the Trinity and the Nicene Creed. They think that Jesus and the Holy Spirit and God the Father are distinct. They certainly consider themselves Christians. And there is a kind of a theological puzzle here that if each of these is divine, how do you say that you're monotheistic? So there's a kind of theological puzzle they have here, and they say something like, well, God is one in purpose, and that's the oneness of God, or something like that. But that's not really relevant. So set that aside for a second. But besides that thing about rejecting the Nicene Creed, it seems it's at core basically to most Christians. Jesus died for our sins. The stories recounted in the Bible are basically true, although the Mormons are comfortable with saying perhaps there's some human corruption in there. But in addition to that, they have these other beliefs on top of it, right? So there's this, there's this idea that the gospel was did not exist on the earth for a while. Like there was no true church on the earth from some time about the time of Jesus and his apostles, or shortly thereafter, to the Restoration, which was by Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith being the prophet of the Restoration, and Joseph Smith brought, he new revelation and revived, ancient scriptures that were supposed to have been lost. So the Doctrine of New Covenants is a book of I guess you'd say, revelations that were given immediately to Joseph Smith. And the Book of Mormon is supposed to be a record of ancient peoples that's similar to the Bible, ancient peoples who had lived in the Americas centuries ago. So who were Christians. So you've got you've got basic Christian beliefs, and you've got these beliefs that there are these scriptures, and some of the beliefs that are distinctive of Mormons, other than the rejection of the Nicene Creed and the idea that they're modern prophets.
Mm-hmm.
They've also got the idea that there are 3 degrees of heaven. Like they go into some specifics about heaven, and they believe in vicarious rituals. But I've got to be honest that I think a lot of the peculiar beliefs to Mormonism, the things that make a lot of Christians say, "Oh my gosh, that's so weird," I don't have a problem with really at all. I mean, I don't have any intuitions about how many degrees of heaven there are. I find it very puzzling that people get wrapped around the axle about things like vicarious rituals, like baptisms for the dead. And I accept the Mormon argument that the atonement of Jesus Christ is sort of vicarious in a way, or essentially vicarious. So it seems like lots of other people are on board with vicarious rituals and vicarious things going on in religion.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have a problem with any of that. And I'm also sort of baffled that people will believe that Jesus is the Son of God, literal Son of God, born to a virgin, died for our sins after performing a bunch of miracles, was resurrected. They're on board with all of that, and also on board with somehow he is identical to his father. But they're on board with all of that. And then you add to that, he also visited some ancient peoples in America after he was resurrected, and they're like, get out of here with that craziness. I just it seems like there's a lack of self-awareness there. So a lot of this doesn't strike me as particularly weird, and my hangups with the church didn't mostly have to do with beliefs that were distinctive to Mormons or are distinctive. Like it could have, I would have probably had these same concerns with any other kind of Christian church, although the emphasis on personal revelation is a little bit different. The other thing I should add that I failed to mention is that Mormons believe that God the Father has a human form, which most Christians reject. Although they do and they can, right, point to biblical evidence of this, where it sure seems like they're saying that God has a human form at various points in the Bible, and taking that metaphorically at some point seems sort of seems like that's not the natural way to read it. So that's one thing that's distinctive of Mormons. Does that answer?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think I was somewhat familiar with some of the beliefs of the Latter-day Saints Church, but the Jehovah's Witnesses, this, I must say that I really don't know what the doctrines and the dogmas are. So Matthew, you can enlighten me.
Sure, they are a restorationist Christian sect that emerged in the 19th century after Mormonism, but sort of in the same spirit. They are millenarians in so far as they believe in a cataclysmic event that will fundamentally change the conditions on Earth and humanity. They are they believe that at any moment, or in their own words, like a thief in the night, Armageddon will commence, and it will be the end of the world as we know it. That is the main, I would say. They're also non-Trinitarian. They believe Jesus is is the Son of God, Jehovah the Father, and he is not God. He is effectively God's highest priest.
Okay.
And the Holy Spirit is not the same as God, but a force which acts upon people, and especially the leadership, the authors of Jehovah's Witnesses doctrines, which are called the governing body, which is actually a group of people who single-handedly draw up the doctrines of the religion. The Holy Spirit is said to give them these words through dreams or visions, or whichever ambiguous way, the same way that the authors of certain books of the Bible were said to have been inspired. But it's a non-Trinitarian, millenarian, restorationist sect of Christianity, and they do consider themselves Christian. Let's see. I mean, there's quirky differences. I could go on for a long time. They believe Jesus died on an upright stake, a single post instead of a cross.
Okay.
I couldn't tell you where that comes from. I just don't remember. We didn't celebrate any holiday that had what's a pagan origin, which are most. But
say a couple of things.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I was gonna ask you a couple of things about comparisons between Mormonism and Jehovah's Witness, but finish your thought.
Oh, I was just going to list one more thing. I was going to say that another major difference is that what death is very much a scientific death, insofar as it's just a lack of consciousness and a non-existence. That's what death is to Jehovah's Witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
And unless you have lived righteously, death is a wormhole to the new system, a restored earth. But for even the gravest sinner, death is merely what a non-believer or a scientifically minded person thinks of death as, which is just the non-existence and non-consciousness.
Okay.
No hell, in other words.
Yeah. That's very interesting.
Spencer, what did you want to add?
So another distinctive feature of the Mormon Church is the belief in latter-day revelation and continued revelation. And there's this succession of prophets that goes on to the current day, starting with Joseph Smith. Russell M. Nielsen, I believe, is now the leader, the prophet. And the quorum of the 12 are also supposed to be prophets, though not the prophet, in that they can have revelation from God that speaks not just to them personally, but to the entire church. Now, this is supposed to seems really radical to people, but it seems to me that the only thing that's especially radical here is the use of the word prophet, right? Like, the Pope, I think, is supposed to be able to make certain doctrinal pronouncements. It seems an awful lot like a prophet to me. And what you're describing with the Jehovah's Witness in the governing body, I think, am I wrong to think that they would not describe themselves as prophets? But it does seem to me that it's prophecy that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think they would. I think you're exactly right. I also think you're right in saying they would get really squeamish about themselves prophets, and I don't think they would ever do it. But effectively, that's what they're claiming to be doing.
Yeah, it's curious. I mean, Muslims insist that Muhammad was the last prophet, Whereas I don't really see anything in Christianity that's quite so definitive that there can't be any more prophets. I mean, some people point to this verse in the book of Revelations that seems to suggest there's not going to be any more revelation after this point. Mormons will point out that there are similar verses in the Old Testament, and yet Christians think that, more came because there's revelation in the New Testament. And even one person, I forget, in the book of Acts, who's described as a prophet after Jesus. And you would think that a religion that wanted to emphasize continuity with the Bible, would include prophets among its leaders. So it's I find it sort of strange that other than the Mormons, there is this tendency to put prophecy, modern day prophecy, at arm's distance. I'm not really sure why that is.
Yeah, not sure either.
Okay. So maybe I can ask you about, what was the first time, or I don't know, were you ever complete believers in it, or did you have doubts from the beginning, or did they arise later, and how and when and what happened if you happen to to voice those doubts to your family and friends? There's maybe we can discuss these issues, and maybe Spencer, you can open.
Yeah, I mean, when I was a little kid, I just couldn't imagine radically disbelieving the things that my parents were teaching me. Although I had a tendency, and still do, to have this tendency to want to be analytical that manifested itself pretty early. I remember one time, discovering that Santa Claus was not real. I was 9. I don't know, it's an embarrassingly late age. And it was on the basis of handwriting analysis of all things. Like, this looks like a note my dad wrote. Anyway, as if there weren't more compelling reasons, to doubt that myth. Anyway, but I remember I actually said to my mom bluntly, like, "Is Jesus fake too?" She was shocked. But you got to think of it, right? Like, your parents have told you this one thing your whole life that you assume to be true. Perhaps there are other things that they're telling you that are not true. But I mean, so I guess there was some doubt there. There's not a whole lot. It came gradually. It came later. It came both from my inability to receive the kind of personal revelation that is supposed to make you, someone who knows that this is true, and also the thought that even if I had received that kind of personal revelation, this is my Quillette essay is all about this. I didn't emphasize this other part of it so much, but there was this further thought that even if I had received it, I don't know that I could put my trust into it. And so then there were these later things that basically now seem to me like good reasons for questioning what the Mormon Church says that didn't really bother me too much at the time. I had this weird obsession right around the end with the flood of Noah, which the church is literalist about. And I became obsessed with reading all this creationist literature that was supposed to explain how, this is in accord with what we know about science, when it seemed to me like, that just does not seem right. And so things like that, weird things like that, started to bother me. But then there are these other things that now seem to me compelling, now seem to me like good reasons for questioning the church's authority that I wasn't so concerned with at the time, like the exclusion of black men from the priesthood until 1978. That seems pretty embarrassing to me now. And, some of these new revelations that the church has finally owned up to because the internet has forced them to, about Joseph Smith and his wives, his multiple wives, some of whom were married to other men. Some of this is extremely embarrassing. And there's a reason that it was kept out of view of church members by the church for as long as possible until they just realize, well, the internet is going to force us to have to address it, or they'll just Google it. So those things weren't really pivotal for me. For me, it was the inability to feel like I had a revelation from God confirming that this is true. And then the dawning realization that it's possible to have a religious experience that isn't veridical, right? Even, just because someone says they have a testimony, or they have the Spirit has told them that it's true and they really believe it, that may not be, just positive evidence that what they've experienced means what they think it means. Those were the things that really motivated me to leave.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, you, in the article on Quillette, you describe a fairly gradual process of, and as you recall, the central problem was this, that you were expected to really, in front of the whole congregation, so to say, you were expected to bear witness, I think is the term, that you really believe, bear witness that God exists, this type of stuff. And you had always trouble doing that and fulfilling this expectation. And can you tell us, what was the reaction of people around you concerning these difficulties that you encountered?
Yeah, I mean, technically, I don't think there's anything in church doctrine that requires you to bear your testimony. You typically call it bearing your testimony,
right?
Also bearing witness, which is the title I chose just because I think it has more general application, and I hope my essay would cause people to think about more general themes. But I don't think there's anything where they say you absolutely have to do this in order to progress in the church. Other than you do have to tell your bishop privately in your interviews or your temple recommend, so that you can participate in the various rituals at the temple, which you would want to do in order to remain a member in good standing. But the culture, nonetheless, really strongly emphasized this ritual of professing your knowledge of the truth of the church to others. So yeah, if you don't do it, you begin to stand out. It begins to be suspicious. People begin to ask about you. This is, I guess, more true, I suppose, for youth. There just weren't that many youth in my ward. Growing up, there was quite a lot of widows and widowers. But if you were growing up and people realized that you had never done it, right? Other adults, not everybody obviously was getting up there to bear their testimonies on the one Sunday a month that was specifically devoted to this. But I don't know. I guess people must have assumed that they had done it at some point or another. But if you're young and they could sort of tell that you hadn't done it, and people would ask if you borne your testimony, say no, or I would say no because I never did, and they'd say, well, a testimony comes in bearing it. I think that might be my least favorite sentence in the English language. I can't even tell you how much that I don't like that.
So the idea is that the fact of uttering your belief will actually make you believe it, right?
Yes, that's right. And my dad explained this to me in terms of William James's as-if principle. I don't know where James wrote this, probably in his psychology somewhere. But William James said that if you want to have a certain quality, act as if you already had it. So that makes a certain amount of sense, right? So you want to be more outgoing and gregarious, and then you act in a more extroverted way, and eventually you'll become that way. Or, you want to be in shape. What would an in shape person do? Eat a certain way, exercise, that sort of thing. But he wanted to apply it to things that had to do with belief. So if you want a testimony, if you want to be somebody who has a testimony, act as if you already have the testimony. That means bearing witness to others that you do know it. But it just seemed to me that just was disanalogous from those other things that I mentioned, right? Like, you don't say that you believe something in order to believe it. And it just struck me, this is just this basic intuition that, I ran into like a rock. I just couldn't get around it. Like, no, you come to believe it and then you testify to others, right? Nobody would get up in court and say that, yeah, this was the man I saw commit the murder, in order to believe that was true, right?
Yeah.
It's just getting the order backwards. And so, yeah, I just resisted the pressure to do it because of this feeling, and people respected that, right? I mean, people really did respect that I had my reasons for not doing it, but it was like they were also worried. They're also like, yeah, it's good that you want to hold back until you have your testimony. I can see why you're not testimony, even though we think that would help you attain one. But it was a respect kind of mixed with this anxiety, like, hurry up and no sort of thing. And especially in my late teenage years, it was really reaching a point of a personal crisis that it just was not coming, and I just wasn't willing to do the things they were demanding of me, I mean, they were telling me, go on a mission so that you can believe it. It's just like, sacrifice 2 years of your life telling other people that that this is true and that they should join this church so that you can know that it's true. And I just thought, that's just not a reasonable thing to ask of anyone. But they're like, oh, yeah, this is really common. Lots of people find their testimonies when they're on their missions. And I just thought, like, that is not a good thing, right? Like, you shouldn't preach what you don't know, right?
Okay. Maybe we can switch to Matthew for a while, and yeah, same question. So, childhood, teenage doubts, reactions to these doubts, and if you express them to your family or friends, this type of thing.
Sure. I would say up until I was the age where young people start getting invited over their friends' houses, but where your parents actually drive you over there and leave you. Up until that age, I was fully bought in. I mean, it was the first explanations for major questions that every person has as a child that I encountered. First and only explanations that I encountered. So, I would say up until what we call middle school, or 10 or between 10 and 12 years old, I 100% believed that, people who weren't Jehovah's Witnesses, who we called worldly, were going to, me and my family and I were going to be cleaning up their corpses off the street after Armageddon, or if the birds hadn't finished them off. And that was the genuine belief we had. My family had, my brothers and my mother had an evacuation plan in our house for Armageddon. So it was a sincere belief, and I felt like I lived in a demon-haunted world until I was a teenager. literally, to borrow Carl Sagan's phrase. I thought, if I brought the wrong CD or tape into the house, I could invite demons in the house,
Mm-hmm.
things of that nature. I excuse myself every day from the Pledge of Allegiance, because Jehovah's Witnesses believe that governments are ultimately controlled by Satan.
Mm-hmm.
And if there was if the kids were cutting hearts out of pink and red construction paper for Valentine's Day, I had to leave the classroom and go sit in the library. I was willing to undergo some fairly embarrassing stuff to preserve my after my eternal life. So I certainly believed it. But it was a war of attrition with just spending a lot of time with these worldly people, because and it was really mostly due to the fact that my father was not a Jehovah's Witness, and he was not happy with. He would be very, very unhappy to know that we were attending meetings and concerning ourselves with crazy ideas. So my mother couldn't get away with saying no to me. If I asked to go hang out with a worldly kid, she couldn't come out and if he was around and she said no, she couldn't say no because he's worldly in front of my father. So I learned to sort of manipulate, and the more time I spent with other families and these people who were my maternal side of the family were, according to them, were doomed. I saw how well they were getting along and how happy they were. Really compared to my own family, they weren't these like wretched, sad, angry, vulgar people. They were just as good, just as happy, and that started to take a toll on me. I realized that a happy life is certainly possible. At least a happy earthly life is certainly possible without being a Jehovah's Witness. And another thing was, when you start getting like female attention in your teenage years, and you realize there's no like Pascal's wager here. There's no hell waiting for me. So if I engage in a mortal sin with a female, I won't be conscious. I'll be unconscious. Dead forever. I think I was actually willing to go for that at some point. While I was still believing, I was willing to do things that were mortal sins in the religion. That's when I really knew that I was on the slippery slope out of the door. And by the time after I graduated high school, I would say around the time of like 9/11. I think actually, as I was watching that happen on TV, I realized that at that point, that at some point in the very recent past, I would have considered that a harbinger of Armageddon. But I was of two minds at that moment. I realized that it was just people who believed like my family believed, who were flying into the buildings. And at that point, I was like, I'm done with all of this. Like there's competing beliefs all over the place, and I want to have a girlfriend, and that's all I care about at this moment. And all my friends are happy. I don't see why I can't be outside of this religion. So, but I never had an intellectual alternative for all of those big questions until later. A few years after that, I started reading like Richard Dawkins, stuff like that, and finally had a intellectually satisfying supplement. But I was willing to go into the deep end for a while, thinking I was going to not survive Armageddon, to enjoy my youth for just a couple of years.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's pretty hardcore stuff.
yeah, just a little.
I hope you told a prospective girlfriend that you're the one I want to sacrifice my immortality. If you didn't, you just, you wasted the best. Yeah.
That's a good card to play for sure.
Yeah. When I thought 9/11 was a harbinger of Armageddon, or, I thought these were the end times. It's funny, I'm actually writing this in my new Quillette article that comes out on 9/11. But I mean, the latter day and Latter-day Saints refers to the fact that this is always, all of us have been in the end since Joseph Smith. But yeah, it didn't play any kind of role in my losing my faith. I do want to point out one, I think, salient difference between our experiences, which is that I did not feel constrained so much by the Mormon strictures. I was very conservative and remained so, and I didn't want to smoke weed or I guess the only thing is I wanted to listen to some music that had swearing in it, and I wanted to watch R-rated movies, but that's as much as I ever wanted to transgress the church's rules. And I didn't welcome the idea of having all of this freedom. I think you can see leaving a strict religion as liberation, and that sounds like it was your experience. But for me, you can also see it as a kind of anomie, right? Mel Durkheim's term for the sense that you don't have enough constraints on you. You don't know what to believe. You don't know how to order your life that had been ordered so well by this religion. And that for me was really distressing. I did feel liberated in the sense that I could believe what I wanted to believe. But that was accompanied by a lot of anxiety, and it was not something that I welcomed. A lot of the freedom was just seemed more like a burden.
Well, no, I felt that same distress. I wasn't as wise as you were. I wasn't anticipating it. I was willing to be rebellious and take the consequences in the hereafter, not even anticipating the crisis that you're describing of like drifting out into the deep end. But I didn't. That was an issue. And you know what? I've never been to therapy. Who knows if it's still an issue or not? I definitely felt those ramifications that you're describing. You were wise to anticipate them.
I don't know. Go ahead. Yeah, it's just sort of instinctual. This sort of like I'd not known any other way of living, and I think this is a fear that is probably more intense the more isolated members are from people of other faiths, right? So like if you never interacted with somebody who was a worldly person, quote unquote worldly, I imagine it would be an even, bigger jump into the dark, right?
Yes. And if my father was also a Jehovah's Witness.
Oh, right. That's a pretty significant anchor point.
Yeah, I think that's the most significant one for sure. But yes, your premise is absolutely right. And I watched people really come undone who came from a tighter, a more insular family. They went off the deep end, flailing, and kind of crashed a lot of them did. Became alcoholics, or they were otherwise, pretty messed up mentally.
It's easy to see how the pendulum could swing really hard in the other direction.
Certainly.
And Matthew, something you haven't addressed much is, how did people around you react? Of course, your father was not part of the faith, but your mom was, and I'm sure other people around you. And yeah,
okay.
How did they react?
Well, so with the Jehovah's Witnesses, you sort of like Spencer's testimony. Being baptized is something that they want a person who has thought about these things enough to make that decision to do it. It's not something you do to it with an intent.
Okay.
Although you occasionally will see like 5- and 6-year-olds doing it.
So this is how these religions stay so small, right?
No,
I'm kidding. It's a joke, but yeah.
I thought I misheard you. Yeah, right. But so I never went through with getting baptized. So all of the Jehovah's Witnesses are very, very penal about people who are baptized messing up or leaving. It's similar to Islam in the way that they treat apostates. Someone who transgresses the religion will be disfellowshipped, and if they go as far as to formally disassociate themselves from the religion, they are in the Jehovah's Witnesses' words, dead to their family. They're like they don't exist.
Wow.
So my mother was baptized. Myself and my 2 brothers were not. So I have things in common with my maternal grandfather, who is an elder in the organization. We play golf together. We talk about worldly things, if you will. But if I was to have been baptized and disfellowshipped, none of that would be going on. None of that would be happening. And my mother's having a hard time because I sort of, when I was going through my big pendulum swing and reading, devouring Richard Dawkins and all those guys, I was sort of preaching to my mother and trying to talk her off the ledge. And I think I had an effect on her. And she doesn't go anymore and talks about it, but I think she has a crisis. But she has real problems with her sister and her mother and father. Their relationship has fundamentally changed.
Yeah.
And it's really sad to notice, but in my house, Vincent, it was just my mom, and I had my 2 brothers as backup, and we just like sort of simultaneously just stood up to her and said, "It's over with. We are not Jehovah's Witnesses," and that's the end of the story. And if you want to argue about it intellectually, good luck. And that was the end. That was the end of it. And I think she was. I honestly think she was dragging us to the meetings to please her parents. I was going to the meetings to please my mother, and that is a flimsy reason to do all this stuff.
Right.
So, it's fine. I mean, like I said, if I baptized, it would be a different story. It would be a sad situation with my family.
Matthew, can I say one thing?
Sure.
Yeah. I want to point out that what you're describing about the sort of ostracism toward people who leave the Jehovah's Witnesses by people who are Jehovah's Witnesses, that's not analogous to Islam. Islam, death is supposed to be the appropriate punishment for somebody who decides it. That's true. And that is carried out sometimes in a vigilant manner. And I just think I just need to say that because I think there's this tendency of people to just sort of run the not that I'm accusing you of well, maybe a little bit, but just generally, I think it's important to emphasize the distinctions, the bad from the worst,
Oh, I'm on your team with that, and you're right, for sure. A lot of Muslims in the Western world can't get away with that, though, and they do get away with treating their family members pretty terribly, who leave the faith, and that's sort of what I meant. But you're right. The prescription is death, and it is carried out around the world, and it's much worse than the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Even in North America, Sarah Hayter, who I interviewed for Quillette a couple of years ago, has said, with her ex-Muslims of North America meetings, a very, very high security events, secret locations, in a way that an ex-Mormon or I imagine an ex-Jehovah's Witness wouldn't be. They're very...
Definitely. There's a big difference.
One is reminded of the words of Sam Harris, who was reminding his audience that not all religions are the same, and he always gives the sort of extreme examples. On the one end, there's the Jains, who are extremely pacifists, if you will. They of course don't eat meat. They do everything to try. They do everything to avoid killing insects or swallowing them. And he always says that the more a Jain becomes an extremist, so to say, in their own religion, the less of a security concern they become. And at the other end of the spectrum, at the other end of the spectrum, arguably, there is Islam as described by
I think
by Spencer.
He also said it's like sports is a catch-all phrase, like religion, and you have badminton and mixed martial arts. That's a good point, Spencer. You're absolutely right. I just can't think of a religion that we in America encounter on a regular basis that treats people who have disassociated themselves with the religion as hostilely, with as much hostility as the Jehovah's Witnesses do.
I can believe it. Scientology is up there, and in fact, they have. Oh yeah. They have actually in people's lives.
Right.
Yeah, I think they're probably worse. They're probably worse.
Yeah, they're worse. One of the big issues, in fact, maybe the main issue I'm worried about most and do the most to try to get people's attention to is jihadism and the evil that it is and its rootedness in traditional Islamic teachings. I just want every liberal to just sit down with me for a half an hour and let's talk through this. Because I hear people making these equivalencies like, oh, well, there are extreme Christians too. There's ISIS, but there's also the Westboro Baptist Church. And I'm like,
yeah, that's ridiculous.
How many gay people have they thrown off of buildings lately? How many people have they beheaded? How many children have they buried alive? There's this, I get this sense that if you're secular, and the whole concept of religion is just very foreign to you. All of what you put in the extremist box mentally is very, very broad. Everything from like my upbringing, your upbringing to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and I just think there's just this lack of moral depth perception that people who are raised in totally secular homes seem to have about some of these issues. Okay, end rant.
No, you're absolutely right. I fear, and Vincent and I talk about this a lot. We've had a full podcast already on Paul Berman's book called Terror and Liberalism. I don't know if you've read that.
No, but I've listened to part of that podcast.
Okay, so it sort of takes a swipe at that the history of people making that sort of clumsy analysis. But we've also just talked online a lot about this, and we've also noticed what you've noticed, that people don't seem to be able to make distinctions. But I think and I know we're off on a different subject now, but I think there's deeper explanations for why people are sheepish about pointing out differences, especially when the main adherents to Islam are a different ethnicity or from another culture that is perceived as being downtrodden or under the boot of colonial power. I think there's more complicated reasons than just a lack of depth perception. I think they're ended by something much more complicated.
Yes, but on that note, you've got something like the Organization on the Islamic Council, or the OIC. I think the actual words it stands for change occasionally. That I think 56 governments are a part of, and it's established religion, and over 26, I think, governments. And it's weird to call something like that downtrodden.
It is.
We could go down this road.
Yeah, I know. It's. I love talking about this stuff. Maybe we'll do it at another time.
Yeah. So we can try to talk about. I mean, this can bring us back to ISIS in by some indirect route, but we can talk about taking religion to logical ends, if you will. So, in the case of Matthew, there is no hell in the religion in which he was raised, so that takes a lot of pressure off of you, and I think it's it changes the game quite a bit, because if you're sort of extremely rationally minded, and if you really believe in the existence of hell, for instance, if you're really consequential about it, rational about it, then I think the lengths to which you should go to avoid that should be completely extreme. And I'm sure. I mean, well, I'm not sure. But maybe you've heard about this guy Armin Navabi is his name, and he runs. I can't remember. Is it American Atheist? No, it's not that. But Atheist Republic, I think, is the group in America.
I'm familiar with the group.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with their presence online, and I don't know who. I've never encountered the person who runs it.
Yeah, so it's Armin Navabi, and he was raised in Iran. And I've heard him tell the story of what he was doing as a child, which is he was so terrified, because he really believed in it. He was so terrified of hell that he thought to himself, it's a long life. It's a certainty that I'm going to sin at some point or another, and this is likely to send me to hell. And so he tried to kill himself as a very young child. I mean, I think he was 10 or something, because he thought, if I kill myself, for sure I'm not going to go to the best part of heaven, but I'm still going to avoid hell, and this is worth everything. So this is what I mean by taking religion to its, quote, logical ends, so to say. And also, you have, I suppose, weirdly logical moves, such as people trying to kill as many infidels or non-believers to avoid them, to prevent them from going to hell, but by sort of saving them in one way or the other. And you have the extreme example of the ISIS people who was happy and thinking that they were saving the gay people that they were throwing from rooftops, because they thought, okay, this execution sort of redeems you, so you will avoid hell and go to heaven thanks to killing you.
Can I comment on that?
Certainly.
Okay. So the preliminary point is Matthew has really illustrated for me all of the many points of similarity between Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons, in the sense that there isn't a traditional conception of hell in Mormonism either, for most people. Now, there is something called outer darkness, and that is a place where Satan and the demons, the angels that followed Satan in the premortal life, and a very, very small number of people will be sent, and in order to get there, you have to have certain knowledge of God's existence and to act against that knowledge. Okay. So you have to look up into the heavens, and it would be like denying the noonday sun. You have to have that level of denial to be eligible for outer darkness. So if a Mormon prophet who speaks with God regularly publicly denied that God existed and became a vicious human being, he would be sent to outer darkness. But since all of the rest of us, typically we don't have that degree of knowledge, we won't be sent there. So it's interesting. And the lowest degree of glory, the celestial kingdom, is supposed to be so good that it can't be revealed to us, or we would kill ourselves to get there. And that's where we would go too, because we wouldn't be eligible for a higher, degree of glory if we committed suicide. Yeah. So it's close to being universalist though, whereas it's not annihilation that awaits most non-believers. It's the second or the third degrees of glory, but they're still pretty good. So in neither religion is hellfire scaring people into submission.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
I wanted to make another comment about extremism, though, which is I don't think this is particularly unique to religion. If you start to study some moral philosophy and you realize that you have a principled position on something, and you think it through, and you can find yourself stuck with some conclusions that don't make you comfortable, right? I find myself even not being religious anymore. I lean with a fair amount of uncertainty toward the pro-life position on abortion, although I've studied the issue pretty carefully and I realize there are arguments on both sides. And it's difficult. I lean toward the pro-life argument. But, if you take the pro-life argument seriously, you've got all of these murders apparently being performed. Shouldn't you do something about that? Isn't that something worth violence to stop? And it's not quite easy to stop that reductio. But you find them on the pro-choice side as well, right? I mean, Michael Tooley, who used to teach here, notoriously argued that, hey, abortion is okay. There's really is no difference between abortion and infanticide. It's just like it's a change of address. So infanticide must be okay too. It's people want to have a position on abortion that doesn't land them with any kind of icky conclusions. But I actually think it's quite hard to even just come up with one that doesn't have some implications that a normal person would be quite uncomfortable with. And that's just abortion. I could go on other issues where you push the logic in certain directions and you find yourself committed to something kind of scary. I think this is just a general fact about moral beliefs. You have some additional variables there if you have hell, right? Because you could kill a bunch of children before they sinned or before they converted to religion. Seems like you ought to do that. So you would have all of on top of the normal sorts of worries about extremism that you might have. But I think this really is something that is with all of us always, the kind of thing you're talking about.
Mm.
Well, didn't the Taliban do that to some school half a dozen years ago? They were checking this boys to see if they had pubic hair before they wiped them out with an AK-47 in some school.
Right.
I heard about that, man. Didn't realize that was the motivation.
I think I'm pretty sure that was. I mean, I know that the report was that they were looking at checking to see if they had gone through puberty, and that was a determining factor in whether they would be killed or not. That just sounds to me like a belief like fully subscribed to.
Yeah, and I even heard Mormons say about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. Well, it's not such a tragedy because those people didn't have the gospel, and now they're being told the truth in the spirit. It's like a purgatory, but it's not for punishment. It's for education for those. It's an attempt to solve the problem of divine hiddenness. Where people who didn't have an opportunity to hear the message in this world will hear it. So I've heard stuff like that. And I think it's true that this is definitely a worrisome feature of religion, but I can also hear in my head the voice of the, rational theist saying back to me, but don't you secular people find yourself saddled with similar problems? And I think I have to admit, yeah, maybe we do.
I think this is a great transition. I don't know. Did you want to comment on that, Matthew?
No, I'm thinking about it. No, I have nothing to say at the moment.
Okay. Well, I think this is a great transition to the next question, which is, well, I tend to ask this to many of the guests, and it concerns substitutes, if you will, for religion. And I think more and more people are making the case that people are finding substitutes for religion in politics, especially Steven Pinker has made this case, Michael Shermer, several other people. I mean, I think it's a recurring theme on Quillette, etc. And it was Spencer was sort of mentioning this idea of that. Well, it's a bit different, but it's related. But certainly, it's the case. It seems to me that people can be also very irrational and very, dogmatic about things that are not usually called religion, but there are many similarities anyway.
Oh yeah.
I've got a lot to say on this, but you want to go first, Matthew?
No, go ahead. You're on a roll.
Yeah, I think you this is a very worrisome point. I think a lot of naive atheists just look at the badness of religion and they're like, yeah, let's just get rid of this. Wouldn't that be great? Whereas I do not have that attitude. I think, well, you think about the roles that religion provides. It gives people a sense of community. It gives people ritual. It gives them structure to their lives. You could name several others. And each of these things can be had independently of religion, but there really isn't anything other than religion that provides all of these things in a sort of package that appeals to the way human beings look for narratives, look for stories, look for symbols. And I don't think that it can easily be replaced, right? I think that you are going to find a kind of replacement, a desire to supplement yourself with something else. And I think politics is where we're most likely to see it. There are various things that strike me as we already see that look to me very much like politics coming in and playing the role that religion used to play. Here's an example: sexual mores, right? it's very interesting to see what's happened with feminism and sexual restraint and all of this, where it seems like we've almost come full circle from the left being against sexual restraints and, gender segregated dorms. Why would we need that? Free love to now, we're being more and more restrictive and worried about sex, although the basis is all about, respecting consent and all of that. But it has a similar feel to it. It feels like something needed to fill the void and impose some structure on this chaotic situation that people found unbearable about what our sexual rules are going to be. I think you see it with nationalism, the rise of nationalism. I think you see it with environmentalism. I think environmentalism is a kind of religion for some people, certainly. And in fact, you could even, it's not hard to point out that it even has its own eschatology, right? I mean, it's similar for certain people. And here's a funny anecdote. I was teaching Sextus Empiricus, the Roman expositor of Pyrrhonian skepticism in my ancient philosophy class a couple of years ago. And a student said, I don't like Sextus Empiricus because I think he would be a climate skeptic. Right? It's like, yeah, I mean, he's skeptical about whether there's a hand in front of his face when he's holding his hand in his face. He's that kind of a skeptic. But It's weird that he would say that he's more troubled. He's more troubled by the thought of skepticism about climate change than skepticism about, do I exist or are there minds other than my own or any of that. I think it indicates that for him, belief in climate change and the struggle against it has taken the role of a religion, because I can't otherwise explain why that would be his first comment.
Yeah.
I watched a town hall discussion the other day about reparations for slavery. When I watched it because Coleman Hughes was going to be on it, and I'm a fan of his, but that is as reminiscent as being in the Kingdom Hall as anything I've experienced in a long time. The conversation that happened there. You had vicarious guilt, vicarious redemption, people talking full paragraphs of just, to me, really incoherent, just pure incoherence. Vague, allusions to the past and comments that felt like a belief in original sin and vicarious redemption. It was really very, very it reminded me very vividly of being in the Kingdom Hall and listening to people talk.
Yeah, John McWhorter on Glenn Lowry's podcast used the term replacement Christianity to describe the kind of moral atmosphere of the current racial politics on the left. And in my own, forthcoming essay on white privilege in the book Ethics, Left and Right, I do mention that there's an easy analogy to draw with original sin and white privilege. And and there are these rituals, right, where you're supposed to stand up and announce that you have privilege, and it's so obviously reminiscent. I mean, people even who favor these kinds of supposedly educational procedures, will even themselves point out that this is a lot like a confessional. But then then of course they'll say it's a myth that white people are guilty. Of course that's a misunderstanding, spread by people who were hostile to racial justice. But then at the same time, they'll quietly concede, okay, it certainly does look like a confessional.
That's the same kind of footwork that the people I had tough questions for when I was a kid would have. So I would ask them, if we're going to live forever on Earth, on a restored Earth, and we're going to reproduce, aren't bodies going to be stacked up into the atmosphere? Like, how are we all going to fit on Earth if those are the parameters? And the what you just described, it's the same type of maneuvering. It's all very reminiscent of religion.
Do you think that people who are raised, because earlier I mentioned that I think people who are raised outside of religion, or whose touch point for religion is like Reformed Judaism or Unitarianism. I had somebody with me on Facebook, somebody with a PhD, asserting that Islam is not a system of beliefs. Okay, dude. Yeah, or like, fine, whatever. But the thing is if that's your notion of what religion is, one, I think that your notion of what religious extremism is thrown completely out of whack. But also, these sort of similarities to religion are not going to be as evident to you, I think, right? Because you've got oh yeah, this reminds me of that. It's not in your database to compare it to.
Yeah. Yeah. I can tell you that when all this stuff, this social justice, very cultish behavior started cracking off around, I guess, 2015, I've been repulsed by it very strongly, and I guess I can attribute that to my upbringing, but it's very deeply repulsive to me.
Oh, before I forget, one more thing in line with this. Peggy McIntosh, who basically got the whole literature on white privilege started. She has, go to her website, and she's got this Notes for Facilitators article that you can read that comes at the end of one of the two major articles. There were two of them. The shorter one was called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. The earlier, longer one is called White Privilege and Male Privilege, a Journey of Coming to Know, or something like that. You look at the Notes for Facilitators, and she wants, there are very explicit instructions that people are supposed to, just go around the room and say things that would be giving supportive evidence for her main theses. And I read it and I thought, this is a testimony bearing meeting. In fact, I said this in my my Quillette article. I might have actually, I can't remember whether I edited it out or not, but I had a Quillette article on white privilege, and where I pointed out that, like, this just sounds religious believers bearing testimony to one another, to a T. Like, just switch out the words, and you've got a testimony bearing seminary class.
I hope you do pursue this angle more, because I think there's a lot of room for this analysis. Is way more. It maps much more perfectly onto this than people are. Like John McWhorter, I read his piece for Time, I think it was, Anti-Racism, America's New Religion, or something. I thought that was it was interesting, but it was just a glancing blow. I really think that this comparison is almost perfect.
There is a long article. Sorry to cut you off, Matthew. There is a long article by James Lindsay, one of the authors of the grievance studies, probe, as they call it. There is a long article in Ario magazine where he, draws a comparison between religion and sort of postmodern social justice, and he argues that the equivalency is not quite there, but there are many similarities, albeit also, although there's also a few differences.
Vincent, you'll have to send me that. I haven't read that.
Okay, yeah, for sure I will. Yeah, it's a long read, but it's really it's worth your time. So I've reached the end of my questions. I don't know if either one of you would like to add something else, or things that I failed to ask about an important aspect of this topic?
Spencer, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Why is it that most of the Mormons I encountered in my youth were unfailingly bubbly, extroverted, very friendly, and about face socially? Is there something going on in the church that promotes that type of personality, or brings that out in someone who wouldn't otherwise be that way, or was that a coincidence?
I mean, no, that stereotype is widely observed, and there's definitely a lot of things underlying it. There are times when you might think that people are putting on that face because it's expected of them, but I don't think that it's necessarily all fake either. I mean, I do think that there are things that the Mormon Church is doing right. I think they do have this sort of structured existence that saves people from a lot of problems. They do tend to have a lot of confidence in their beliefs, and their message. Their spiritual message is optimistic, right? There's not a lot of hellfire and damnation angle here. They emphasize that, like, even people who have never heard of the Mormon Church will have the potential to learn about it and be saved. And there's this sense of mission, even with the way they view marriage. And I think I'm a conservative in political beliefs and in temperament. And even though I'm quite critical of the Mormon Church, my inclination is to see, what are they doing right? What is there here that's worthy of preserving? What is there here that we should be worried about leaving behind? And I just think that, they wear these rings, the CTR rings for choose the right, and they're sort of unabashed and opened about their concern for wanting to live upright and wanting to avoid even, small tokens of evil, swearing and things like that. I think there's something wholesome about that that's easily mocked, but there's something good there. And maybe that. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I had good friends who were Mormons, and, there's always something about their, the way they interacted with each other when they outnumbered me that I was sort of envious of. They seemed like healthier in some way that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I have no doubt that what you're saying is true.
Yeah, somebody put it to me this way. There's a guy I know who is like a secular Jew who took up a teaching position at Idaho State University and was suddenly surrounded by Mormons. And he's like, you just will never find a group of people more devoid of hipster irony, right?
Yeah.
They'll tell you that, I went to Applebee's last night and it was great. And they'll be like you're fantastic, right? No, they're not, and the whole choose the right thing, and I came to see it stands out especially good in contrast to another kind of teenage culture that I was sort of exposed to, that never really held much attraction for me. And this is the kind of teenage culture that surrounds music like, Korn and Slipknot and bands like this, and where it seemed like it's almost this sort of microculture that celebrates dysfunction. And if you want to say something is good, you don't say that it's good. You say that it's sick or filthy or, something like that. Sick. Yeah. That's so messed up. That's freaking disgusting. That's how you say something's good. And it almost like lionizing disorder and depression and, treating, a cynical view of reality as necessarily containing some very deep truth.
Yeah,
I think that
yeah.
that kind of subculture, I think, sustained sustains probably to this day the cult around the Columbine killers and that sort of thing. So I think there's a kind of I don't know how to put it. A kind of orientation toward the good that goes in the opposite direction of that. And I think that might be one of the things that the Mormon Church is doing right.
Yeah, it's noticeable for sure. Okay. Well, I mean, that was my only off-topic question about that.
All right. So if it's okay with both of you, we can end it here.
Sure. I really enjoyed the conversation, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you both. It was really good. Yeah, this is something I've been wanting to do for quite a while. Have people who left their faith come and bear witness, right?
That's right.
To this experience. No, it's very interesting, and yeah, thanks a whole lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Y'all take care.
Thank you for listening to Liberté Académique. We are a science, critical thinking, and freedom podcast. We interview researchers, teachers, and authors who have interesting ideas and who defend free, rational, evidence-based thought. We oppose as best we can a sort of anti-intellectualism coming from a section of the intellectual class. We carry out interviews in English and in French. You can find all our episodes on YouTube and on SoundCloud, as well as on the main podcasting platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, and several others. We are also present on Twitter at AcadFreedom and also on Facebook.